Hello and welcome to the online Train the Trainer course offered by Hamilton County Developmental Disabilities Services. My name is Regina Vogt and I'm with the Innovation and Quality Department, and I hope the next 2 hours are helpful for you in giving you guidance on how to train your staff according to the DoDD training requirements. So this slide is going over what we'll be covering today. The first is an overview of the training requirements themselves. Second, who is authorized to provide training. And then I'll get into the topics themselves, an overview of serving individuals with developmental disabilities, the roles and responsibilities of direct care staff. And this is a topic that went into effect 10/1/15, and it's taking the place of one of the former required topics, which was Principles of Waiver Services. The next topic is MUI and UI, Rights of Individuals with Disabilities, Universal Precautions, and then I'll go over a couple of additional training requirements. And then I'll touch on the information that you should include on your training certificates. And then we'll conclude with some of the practices of best providers. And this slide is just a reminder that what we'll be covering today is an overview of provider responsibilities, and it's really not the full list. You as a provider will be responsible for developing your own thorough training, and this is just designed to help you. So really you'll have to use your best judgment on what to include in your trainings. And everything that you're responsible for can be found on the rules website on the DoDD site, and the link is as you see on the screen. An overview of training requirements. So when staff first start with your agency, they will need to have 8 hours of initial training before they work with individuals with disabilities. And the topics that should be covered in the 8-hour training are overview of serving individuals with developmental disabilities, roles and responsibilities of direct care staff, and then there's a few subcategories under that, MUI and UI, and that needs to include the health and welfare alerts on the DoDD website, rights of individuals with disabilities, and universal precautions. And the rule for this training requirement is located on the link that I have on the screen. And there is also a PDF format of this entire presentation on our website, so you can access that so that you can highlight the links that I will be providing in this training and then visit those websites. So every year after the initial year, staff will have to have annual training, and those topics are some of the same ones as in the initial training. The role and responsibilities of direct care staff, and again there's those topics that are included within that. MUI and UI again, and rights of individuals again. Something that is very important, the training topics that I have just discussed are according to the provider certification rule. Now, above and beyond the provider certification rule, providers have to also train their staff on topics that are listed under the rule for the service provided. So, in order to find out what those training requirements are, you'll want to go to the DoDD rules page. And the way I usually will find it, the easiest, is I'll do Control+F command, and then I'll search for the type of service that I'm looking for. So the most common type of service is homemaker personal care, and then you'll just look under the rule for the type of service that you are providing. So for homemaker personal care, that is, of all the residential services, the one that requires the most training. So if you're a residential agency and if you're wanting to cover any possible topic you would need, you're best to go according to the training requirements for homemaker personal care. Now, adult day support has slightly different training requirements, so you'll want to make sure that if you're a day support provider, that you look under that rule. So I often get the question, who is authorized to provide training? And to be honest, there really is not a requirement that providers have to have the train the trainer course before they train their staff. The only requirement for agency providers is that they have training be conducted by a current employee who has a minimum of 2 years experience. That is the only requirement. Now, if you're an independent trainer, you would be authorized to train if you have a minimum of 5 years of experience working in the field, with at least 2 of those years being as a supervisor or in an administrative capacity. So these are some of those agencies that don't provide services but that just do training, and that's the training requirement for those types of entities. So now we'll start to get into the actual topics that are required as a part of the training. And the first topic is the overview of serving people with developmental disabilities. So a really good way to start off with this topic is to have your staff turn to their neighbor and discuss what drew you to this line of work. That's when you really get people to come out of their shell and talk about why this is so important to them. Usually they might say that they've had a family member with a disability and it caused them to develop a passion for this line of work. And it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the day because people start out talking about something that they're passionate about, and it kind of tugs at people's heartstrings. And then once they've talked to their neighbor, people can then discuss as a group why they went into this line of work. And the definition of developmental disability is that it is a physical or mental impairment other than a mental illness alone. So sometimes we at the county will get a call from a family member saying, I really want to connect my family member who has bipolar disorder with your services. Well, unless that person happens to have a developmental disability alongside the bipolar disorder, they would not qualify. The second qualifier for a developmental disability is that it has to have occurred before the age of 22. That's considered the developmental period in a human being's life. The disability has to be likely to continue indefinitely. There's the phantom check mark coming in. And then it also has to result in a functional limitation in areas of daily living. And we'll talk about what those areas are in just a little bit. So how to qualify for services through Hamilton County DD Services. If the person is under the age of 3, all they need is 1 developmental delay. If they're between the ages of 3 and 6, they need to have 2 developmental delays. And if they're over the age of 6, they need to have a substantial functional limitation in at least 3 major life areas. And this is in addition to having a diagnosed developmental disability. And what are those life areas? Self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency if the person is over the age of 16. And these life areas really do hit on every possible developmental disability. So for instance, if you have an individual who has cerebral palsy, but they have a completely typical IQ, they do not have an intellectual disability, they would still qualify for services because the 3 life areas that they would likely struggle with would be self-care, mobility, and capacity for independent living. And now I'll talk about some of the causes of developmental disabilities. And really the answer to that is that doctors really are not usually sure what caused a developmental disability in a person. However, there are some factors that have been proven to increase the risk of a child being born with or later developing a developmental disability. And those risk factors are on the screen. Lead paint is something that we don't see quite as much anymore because paint typically doesn't have lead anymore nowadays. And the genetic factor is something we do see a lot. We actually have lots of occasions with Hamilton County where we'll serve a parent and a child, both of whom have a developmental disability. And now what I'll do is I'm going to go through some developmental disabilities that are common. And the format that I'm going to use, first I'm going to talk about what the actual disability is, and then I'm going to talk about what you might see when you encounter someone with that disability. So the first disability that I'll discuss is an intellectual disability, and that's the disability that we see most often. In order for it to be classified as an intellectual disability, it has to occur before the age of 18. It includes below average intellectual functioning and a lack of skills necessary for daily living. It can range from mild to profound. And the statistic is that about 4 to 5% of the population has an intellectual disability. And of that 4 to 5%, 90% has a mild intellectual disability. And just to expand on this a little bit more, I've given the different IQ thresholds for each of the categories of intellectual disability. And then just a reminder that the IQ score alone does not determine whether a person is diagnosed with an intellectual disability. The individual also has to have limitations in their adaptive behavior. They have to really struggle with getting their daily needs met. And some of those areas are conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. And for what you might see with an intellectual disability, you're going to probably see anxiety around unexpected change. You're going to see self-injurious behaviors, difficulty with speaking at times, short attention span and distractibility. The individual will probably require more time to learn a task. They're going to have significantly lower academic achievement than their peers. They're going to talk about a favorite subject despite people trying to change the subject. They may be nonverbal, and we now say, use the term non-traditional communicator, or the person might repeat back what you say, and the person might be over or under sensitive to sounds, lights, and smells. The next diagnosis is traumatic brain injury, and that occurs when a sudden trauma causes damage to the brain. The head is suddenly and violently struck. It either hits an object or an object pierces the skull and enters the brain tissue and then causes brain damage. And the symptoms can be mild, moderate, or severe and may result in physical disability. What you might see with a person with traumatic brain injury, They are likely going to be unable to retain information that they may have heard or read, so they won't have the best long-term memory and probably not even the best short-term memory. They're going to likely have weak comprehension of long directions, lectures, and reading assignments. They may seem hopelessly lost and unable to sort things out. They will likely have impaired judgment, and they will also be unable to plan their actions and foresee the consequences. They will likely act in socially inappropriate ways, and they will have difficulty applying a recently learned skill to other situations. People with traumatic brain injury have really difficulty with impulse control. The diagnosis of autism, that impairs a person's ability to communicate and relate to others. It is associated with rigid routines and repetitive behaviors, and the symptoms can range from mild to severe, so most of us know that autism is known as a spectrum. In what you might see with autism, the person may show an obsessive interest in a single item, idea, activity, or person. They might show aggression to others or themselves, and a behavior that we often see is headbanging. They will likely have difficulty with changes in their routine. They'll probably be better learning with visual aids. They'll have difficulty with transitions, difficulty with attention, and like intellectual disability, they will talk on a favorite subject that they'll continue to talk on despite attempts for others to change the subject. They also may be non-traditional communicators, or they might repeat back what you say, and they may be under or oversensitive to sounds, lights, and smells. Deaf or hard of hearing. A lot of this stuff is a little bit more common sense. So hearing loss does range from mild to profound. And the deaf community has a lot of different ways, depending on the person, that they like to perceive their disability or refer to themselves. For instance, some people who are deaf feel that it's such a huge part of their identity that they prefer to be labeled as deaf with a capital D. And then people who have difficulty hearing may use hearing aids, cochlear implants, or other assistive listening devices. And what you might see in people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and again, this is more common sense stuff, you'll have difficulty in getting the person's attention when you're not in their line of sight. They'll have difficulty hearing in loud areas. They'll have to lean in to hear better, and they will also perhaps use a hearing aid. Cerebral palsy. This is a diagnosis that appears during the first few years of someone's life as a result of a brain injury, and it affects the individual's ability to coordinate their body movements. And a lot of times people with cerebral palsy also have other neurological disorders. Oftentimes intellectual disability does co-occur. However, there are people with cerebral palsy who do not have an intellectual disability. And the symptoms usually don't worsen with age, and they also range from mild to severe. So some people with cerebral palsy are able to walk, other people have to use a wheelchair. What you might see with cerebral palsy, the person's speech may be difficult to understand. Their muscle tone is going to vary from either too stiff to too loose. They might have tremors or difficulty with precise motions, such as writing or buttoning a shirt. Their gait may be asymmetrical, and they may have difficulty hearing and seeing. They might struggle with their muscle coordination, and they might have excessive drooling, difficulty swallowing, and sucking. And something to note with difficulty swallowing, a lot of individuals who have cerebral palsy are on Dr. special doctor ordered diets, and it's so important that agency providers, independent providers, staff all read the doctor ordered diet and definitely abide by it. We've actually had a number of individuals over the past few years that have unfortunately passed away due to choking when a caregiver did not follow their specific diet. A spinal cord injury is a damage or trauma to the spinal cord that results in a loss or impaired function, causing reduced mobility or feeling. And the common causes of this type of damage are trauma or disease. Spinal cord injuries can be complete, which means there is no function below the injury, or they could be incomplete, which means there is some movement or sensation below the injury. And then two diagnoses that you've probably heard are paraplegia and quadriplegia. Paraplegia is when there's a loss of sensation and movement in the legs and in part of the trunk or all of the trunk. And then quadriplegia is when there's paralysis of all four limbs. So there's loss of sensation from the neck down. What you might see with a spinal cord injury is atrophy of the hands. You might see muscle spasms. There may be limited or no sensation beyond the injury location. And the person is going to need to use a variety of supports depending on how severe their disability, anywhere from crutches to wheelchairs to respirators. And now I'm going to talk about Down syndrome. There are actually 3 types of Down syndrome total, but I'm just going to talk about the most common type, which is trisomy 21. And in this type of Down syndrome, the individual has a full or partial extra copy of chromosome 21. And overall, the cause of Down syndrome is unknown, but it has been determined that older women who get pregnant are at a higher risk of having a baby with Down syndrome. And virtually all people with Down syndrome do have a learning disability. And the other 2 types of Down syndrome that are very uncommon are mosaicism and translocation. And those 2 types of Down syndrome often have the individual with fewer characteristics that are commonly associated with Down syndrome. What you might see with Down syndrome is low muscle tone, flat facial features with a small nose, an upward slant to the eyes, small skin folds on the inner corners of the eyes, small abnormally shaped ears. The person may be hyperflexible. They might have an enlarged tongue that tends to stick out. And then unfortunately, people with Down syndrome do have a higher prevalence of other diseases, such as heart disease, thyroid disease, visual impairments, and hearing impairments. And another unfortunate thing in Down syndrome is that people with Down syndrome have a greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia earlier in life, and this can actually be as early as in their 40s. And this is your training to make whatever you want it to be, so you can definitely feel free to include information on any other disabilities that you find relevant, especially if your agency specializes in a certain population. You'll definitely want to provide information on that diagnosis. So when you're in the room with your staff and you're teaching them about these different diagnoses, what you can then do is have them split up into groups and discuss what they can do to support people with each of these diagnoses. So you can assign a diagnosis to each group and then just give them some time to brainstorm that, and then come back together as a big group, and then you'll go over what people's ideas are. And here are some of the ideas that we have. For people with intellectual disabilities, an option is When the person is having trouble understanding, you can repeat yourself. You can use different, maybe more simplified words. And then make sure you don't get frustrated, because that's just going to make the person feel really bad about themselves. You can break up ideas into manageable bits that can be easily remembered. And then always be considerate of the tone of voice you use when talking to people with intellectual disabilities. Unfortunately, some people do talk down to people with intellectual disabilities and kind of refer to them in a childlike way, and that's really disrespectful. So really be conscious of keeping all of your conversations at an adult to adult level. For people with traumatic brain injury, you would need to allow additional thinking time for the person before they respond to you, so don't try to rush them. Excuse me. You would use a written checklist of steps for complex tasks, so that would help the person break down how to do the task. Limit the distractions for the person and avoid surprising them. And if you're describing or explaining something to a person with a traumatic brain injury, it's helpful to ask them to repeat what you just told them, and that helps you to gauge if they understood you. And then be aware that their fatigue level may be high, since it does take them a little more energy to comprehend things, so avoid overloading them with information. And you're also going to want to allow them more time to adjust to new situations, activities, and tasks. For people with autism, it's helpful to provide consistent routines. People with autism are very focused on having that routine every day. And when you cannot keep up with their routine, when their day is going to look a little bit different, make sure you give them prior warning so that they can prepare for that change. They also need longer time to respond when you're asking a question. Make sure you change their environment to meet the individual's sensory needs. And if you ever have any questions on some sensory options for people with autism, you can always call our agency. We do have some occupational therapists that can help you out. Also, make sure you know how long a person can stick with an activity before needing a break. Maybe their attention span isn't quite as long as another person. To get them to understand some social appropriate type behavior, you can always use social stories so that you can teach folks about appropriate conversations to have. You can use pictures to communicate, and that also helps the person ask for what they want or need if they are non-traditional communicators. And then you can also use a visual schedule to show the order of activities that they're going to be engaging in throughout the day, and that'll help prepare them for their day. For persons who are deaf, it's helpful to tap the person's shoulder or flicker the lights to let them know that you're in the room with them. And you're going to want to face the person and make eye contact and speak slowly and clearly, but don't raise your voice. And you'll want to make sure that you're not obscuring your mouth at all or chewing gum, because the person is going to be looking at your mouth and trying to read your lips. If the person uses an interpreter, you always want to speak to the person and not to the interpreter. And if the person is having a hard time communicating with you, you can always put a pen and paper to use and write down what you're trying to tell the person. That is, if they are able to read. For people with cerebral palsy, you'll want to make sure that they always have access to their adaptive equipment. If they struggle with communication, you'll need to find a way for them to communicate effectively with you, even if you have to get creative with that. And then again, you'll just want to slow down and make sure you give them plenty of time to respond. For people with Down syndrome, since they do struggle with learning, a lot of these recommendations are going to be similar to that of someone with an intellectual disability. So you'll want to break learning down into small, manageable steps and ensure that there's plenty of time for the person to process information and respond. You'll want to give them lots of opportunities to learn and practice new skills. And if you're struggling with communicating with the person, you can always use visual aids to help. And slow the pace of your conversation with the person and give them plenty of time to respond. And then as the person's getting a little older, entering their 40s, just really keep an eye on them. And if they show any signs at all of dementia, make sure you immediately get them to a care provider so that they can get the help that they need. There are really good medicines that can really slow the progression of Alzheimer's and dementia. For people with spinal cord injuries, make sure that you always check for the best seating position for them so that they are comfortable. Always ask the person before you touch or move them. And then beware of their sensations or lack thereof for possible injury. And that would really come into play for bathing people. You'll want to make sure the temperature of the water is safe. For people who use aids to move, and this is just a more general slide on how to help people who don't necessarily have a certain diagnosis but who do use aids to move. For wheelchair users, always ask the person if he or she would like assistance before you jump in to help. Unfortunately, people with who use wheelchairs, oftentimes people want to baby them and they really might not need or want your help. Don't hang on a person's wheelchair or lean on it. Some people who use a wheelchair actually consider their wheelchair an extension of their body. So it's really disrespectful to lean on a person's wheelchair. If you're having them read paperwork or having to sign, make sure that the paperwork is within their reach. And then if you're trying to communicate with someone who uses a wheelchair, it's really helpful to sit down or to kneel down so that you're at the same eye level as the person. And that way the person will really know that you're talking to them as an equal. And lastly, you'll want to always keep walkways clear of debris so that the person can navigate their home or their place of work. And then people with speech difficulties, and this again could be whichever diagnosis, you would not want to finish the person's sentence for them. I know we live in a fast-paced society where we, do everything so fast, everything's multitasking and all of that, but really it's so disrespectful and it really takes away a person's voice excuse me, when we finish their sentences for them. So you're going to really want to give them adequate time to finish what they're saying, even if they do talk slowly. And if you can't understand a person, don't pretend that you know what they're saying. And the person can usually tell when you're pretending that you know what they're saying when you really don't. Instead, just ask the person to repeat him or herself, or if despite multiple repetitions you still don't know, you can have someone who might know the person a little bit better help you, or maybe if the person's able to write, you can have him or her write that down. And something that we think it's really important as a county to include in the Train the Trainer is information about co-occurring disorders. And the reason that is because people with developmental disabilities are much more likely than the general population to also have mental illness. And two of the most commonly seen mental health diagnoses among people with developmental disabilities are depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And unfortunately, the reason for the post-traumatic stress disorder is because people with developmental disabilities more than likely have been abused at some point in their life or neglected. They've experienced some type of trauma. So that makes them at a much higher risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So a description of PTSD: a person with this diagnosis re-experiences an extremely traumatic event over and over again. So this person might be having flashbacks, they might be having intrusive dreams, and they're going to, as a result, be always on guard all the time. They're going to try to avoid things that remind them of the trauma. So if there was a certain TV show on while they were being abused, they'll want to make sure that they never watch that show. Or if there's a certain part of town where the trauma happened, they might avoid that part of town. For someone to have a diagnosis of PTSD, the symptoms still have to be active a month after the trauma occurs. So because of this, most people who've been through trauma, they're going to immediately have symptoms that are similar to PTSD, just because anybody who experiences trauma is really going to struggle. But if those symptoms stay after a month, that's when the person actually meets the criteria for PTSD. And then those symptoms are going to show the person declining in their social, occupational, and other type of functioning. What you might see with PTSD is an emotional numbness, or you might also see anger, or you might see the person withdrawing. The person's going to have disorganized or agitated behavior, and they might act out rather than think things through. They might have destructive behavior both toward themselves or toward others. And because they're always on guard, they're always under such tremendous stress, that actually takes a toll on their bodies. So they're going to have physical complaints, their health might not be the best, and their overall functioning might be compromised. Some methods to support people with PTSD. It's really helpful if you work with them to find a way for them to have self-calming and to reduce their arousal. So that might include meditation, it might include a hot bath, maybe some aromatherapy, some yoga, even prayer, whatever is helpful for the person. And since they're always kind of high-strung to begin with, you never want to surprise a person with PTSD. You really want them to always know when you're coming. Don't speak in a loud tone or yell at them ever. Always be very calm and have a soothing tone. And then anytime they threaten to hurt themselves, you're going to want to take that seriously. So if you need to, you can always call mobile crisis, or you can call the police, and the police can help you determine if the person would need to go to the hospital. Some information about depression. The person is going to experience depressed mood, or loss of interest or pleasure in most activities. They might be irritable, and they might feel excessive guilt or hopelessness or worthlessness. They might even be suicidal. What you might see with depression, you might see wakefulness, or on the flip side, you might see the person sleeping all the time. The person might lose weight or they might gain weight. Maybe when they're depressed, they aren't hungry, or maybe they use food to cope with their depression. They might be emotionally unresponsive. So as you're talking to them, they're not really responding to you. They're not smiling. They're not frowning. They're just kind of keeping a flat affect. They might exhibit some anxiety, and they might also have very little interest in going out into society. If they did have interest in sex before, they might lose that interest. And then lastly, as I had said before, they might show some irritability. Some ways to support people with depression. One is to encourage a routine every day, and that'll help the person be able to fill their day with meaningful activities so that they're not tempted to stay in bed all day or watch TV all day. And it's really important to support healthy eating because eating junk food is going to actually make the mood even worse. And then to really encourage exercise because exercise is a natural antidepressant. You can encourage the person to stay awake during the day any way possible, and then always support socialization because whenever people reach out to those that love them, they'll feel more supported, they'll feel loved, they'll remember that they're a valued person in this world. So that's all the diagnoses that I'm going to go over. And just to wrap it up, here are some just kind of some pieces of advice. So I know we've just gotten done talking about all these labels of all these different diagnoses, but once the person's diagnosed and they've qualified for services, really after that, there's really no need for us to discuss labels anymore at that point. And if the person with a disability, if there is no need to mention their disability, if it's not relative to the conversation, then don't mention their disability. And avoid asking the person questions about their disability because, we wouldn't want someone asking us personal questions. If the person does want to discuss some of the specifics of their disability, then that can be something that they initiate. Common sense, people with disabilities are just like people without disabilities. And then we really should pay attention to the language that we use when we are referring to people with disabilities. We don't want to use words that evoke pity, so like words like unfortunate, afflicted, a victim. We don't want to use the R word, and we don't want to say things like wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. We would rather say that a person uses a wheelchair. When describing people without disabilities, we'll say that they're typical. We don't want to say that they're normal because if we're calling people without disabilities normal, that's like saying people with disabilities are abnormal, and that's not the case. And then it's always important to use people first language, and this is something that you can really talk about at length with your staff. So you'll definitely want to say a person with Down syndrome rather than a Down syndrome person, or a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. And then finally, again, we just finished talking about some of the different ways that people with different diagnoses struggle in their lives, but at the end of the day, we really just need to focus on what people are capable of doing. So that is it for an overview of developmental disabilities. And now we are going to move on to role and responsibilities of direct care staff. And this category has a number of subcategories, and I'm going to break each of those down and I'll provide information on those different subcategories. And the first subcategory is person-centered planning. And this is something that really started being stressed in about 2014. There's a much greater focus on individuals having a say and actually being the main author of their plan, being the person who decides what they want in their life and who they want to have help them. So what is the purpose of person-centered planning? One of the purposes is to improve the social status of people with disabilities. So throughout history, people with disabilities have really been seen as second-class citizens, and that absolutely has to change. So by giving people with disabilities the power to decide what supports they need, to decide what they want to do with their lives, that's going to ultimately improve their social status. In addition, it's going to enhance the perception that society holds of people with disabilities. And then it's also going to expand the network of allies and associations within people's lives. And here are some of the key elements of person-centered planning. Number one is that it's always driven by the individual. It includes people chosen by the individual, and it occurs at times and locations that are convenient for the individual. It uses language that the individual can understand, and it always offers choices to the individual regarding the services and supports that they need and from whom. It's conducted to reflect what's important to the individual, and it always ensures that the delivery of services are according to what the person wants while also ensuring their health and welfare. And lastly, it identifies the strengths, preferences, needs, and the desired outcomes of the individual. So what does this look like when we put it on paper? DODD actually has come up with some activities that are completed at the time of the MyPlan meeting, and these different activities really help the SSA and the team to really get to know the person, and that in turn can help the person identify the outcomes that they'd like to see in their life. So one of the first tools that are used during the MyPlan is the Like and Admire tool. And this is really an awesome opportunity for the individual's team to just brag on the person. So you're going to talk about what others appreciate about the person, what attracts others to that person, what are the great things about the person, what do people admire about the person, what are they good at, what compliments does the person receive. And the next tool is the 2-minute drill. And this really gets at the very most essential, important things about the person. And then what the SSA is going to do when they're conducting this tool is to ask the person to, if they had 2 minutes to introduce themselves to a new person, take that 2 minutes and share the most important things about them. And if the person isn't it struggles with communication, the team can always chime in and help with this 2-minute drill. And the next tool is the relationship map. And this map lists all of the important people in the individual's life, and it actually assigns that important person to the way that they help the person to participate in really important activities. So an example of that would be maybe a person's favorite line leader at the workshop, or a person's favorite friend at church who helps them volunteer at church. It could be a family member that they talk to every day on the phone. So this is just going to create this network of all the people that really help the person seek out the activities that they most value and be a really fully participating member in society. The next tool is the Good Day, Bad Day tool. And this is really helpful, especially for direct care staff. They can reference this so that they can see what qualities of the day would make it a bad day for a person, so that they can try to avoid having those things happen. Or if they do happen, this tool needs to list some different ways that the team can assist the person if they are having a bad day, so that they can minimize the person's frustration. So maybe a bad day would look like the person, maybe their work closed because of a snow day. That might be the beginning of a really bad day. And then maybe they also realize that they're out of cigarettes that day. Just kind of like all the triggers that could cause the person to become really frustrated. And then on the flip side, the team would discuss all the factors that would make it the absolutely best day possible. The next tool is the Routines and Rituals tool, and this really helps the person to describe some of the important routines that really make their day meaningful for them. And by identifying the routines, they can really prepare for transition to new activities. And the very last tool is the gifts, talents, and things I'm good at tool. And this is similar to the first one in that it's another opportunity for you to really brag on the person and just really help the individual talk about their gifts, talents, and the things that they're good at. And by listing all these things, it also helps you identify opportunities for the person to really raise their self-esteem by engaging in more of these things. So for instance, if the person is really good at art, you can then help the person find different ways to connect with other artists in the community and maybe even sell some of their art. So all of those tools are actually going to be in the My Plan that you receive in your email after the My Plan meeting. And all of the information received from conducting those tools is going to help the team and the individual identify what the individual wants his or her outcomes to be. And those outcomes are going to be listed in the My Plan. And My Plans are now much more focused on outcomes. The outcomes are in the forefront of the plan, and the outcomes are basically their descriptions of what's important to the person and their goals for achieving those important things. And it's also going to list what the team's responsibilities are for helping the person achieve their goals. And if we talk about the responsibilities of direct care staff, they are actually going to be the people, the frontline people who are responsible for helping individuals achieve these outcomes. And they're going to need to be documenting the progress as the person's trying to achieve these outcomes. So this is how it would look in the My Plan. So in the example on the screen, the person's outcome is that they want to improve their physical health. They want to become more active and lose weight. So as the provider, what you are going to do is look for which of the action steps that you are responsible for. So if you are the residential provider, you would look at the action steps and see that you're responsible for number 1, 2, and 3. If you're the day program provider, you'll see that you're responsible for number 4. So once you have read the My Plan and you see what you're responsible for in terms of the outcomes, you would then need to create a documentation sheet so that your staff can begin working on these outcomes with individuals and starting to implement those action steps. And we do have a form that we've created that providers are welcome to use, and it's on our website. And this is the form you see on the screen. And this is just an example filled out of a fictional person named Jane. And as you see, it's that outcome that was just in the My Plan. So you're going to want to write that word for word on the documentation sheet. So it is important for me to improve my physical health, etc. And then you're going to want to take the action steps that you as the provider are responsible for. And you're going to want to actually write those next to the outcome and include the frequency for each action step. And then underneath, that is where the direct care staff are going to want to start documenting Jane's progress as she starts working toward her outcome. So on the date of August 2nd, the staff wrote that the location of that action step was at Jane's home and also at Kroger. And the staff person wrote that Jane chose all of the meals she'd like to eat for the week. And they made a grocery list together and went to the grocery store. The staff helped Jane choose nutritious options. Jane was enthusiastic about meal planning and the shopping trip. And then the staff would write their initials. And this actually corresponds to both action step 1 and action step 3. And then if you see on 8.3, they actually worked on action step 2 together by going to Winton Woods to exercise. So the staff will want to work on each of those action steps, document how the person's doing with the action steps, and make sure that they work on the action steps at the frequency listed in the My Plan. Another important part of person-centered planning is the Employment First initiative. And I pulled this quote from the ohioemploymentfirst.org website. It was stated that according to state law in Ohio, employment services for people with developmental disabilities shall be directed at community employment, and all people with developmental disabilities are presumed capable of community employment. So a lot of people, after they heard about Employment First, were a little bit nervous because they felt that perhaps their family member with a disability wasn't appropriate for community employment. But the Employment First initiative is not saying that people are going to be forced to get jobs in the community, especially if they're not ready. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So under the Employment First initiative in the person-centered plan, the individual is going to pick what their long-term goal is for employment. And there's one of 4 options that they're going to choose. The first is that they have a job, but they would like a better one or to move up. The second is that they want a job and they need help finding one. The third is that they honestly are not sure about work and they just need some help to learn more about it. And then number 4, I don't think I want to work, but I may not know enough about it. So really the focus of Employment First is to really make sure people know all of their options. And if they do decide they want a community job, then the team will work together to help the person get that job. And this is likely going to be the responsibility of a job coach, a job developer, a day program. The residential provider will likely not have as much of a role in this. All right, so that was person-centered planning. And the next subcategory under role and responsibility of direct care staff is community integration. And really, one of the things that really started the push for integration was the Olmstead Act from 1999. And in this court hearing, the Supreme Court ruled that it is actually a violation of the civil rights of Americans with disabilities to require a person to be institutionalized to receive the care that they need, if these services can actually be provided in the community. So this is going to really but cause there to be more of a focus on getting individuals out of institutions, getting them into the community, and living with people without disabilities. When you start talking about what the direct care staff's role is in this integration topic, a really neat way to really pinpoint just how important the direct care staff's role is to engage them in the circle of support exercise. And I'll take you through that. So you'll have your staff in the room and you'll be talking to them about, integration. And what you'll want to do is have them draw a circle with them in the center. And then you'll want to have them draw another circle, concentric circle. And in the very first circle outside of themselves, that is the circle of intimacy. And within the circle of intimacy, you will ask your staff to write the names of the people in their life that they absolutely cannot live without. So that would be perhaps their absolute best friend since childhood, or it might be their spouse or their significant other, maybe their mother. So you'll give them some time to write those names down. And then you'll ask them to draw another circle. And you'll let them know that the next circle is the circle of friendship. And within that circle, you'll ask them to write the names of all of their friends. Again, you'll give them some time to do that. And then you'll ask them to draw another circle. And that next circle is the circle of participation. And you will ask them to write the names of everyone in their life that is a part of their life because they're in some type of common group with you. So that could be someone in your book club, someone that goes to your church, maybe someone on your volleyball team, someone that you're only connected to because you're participating in some type of common activity. And then the final circle is the circle of exchange. And in that circle, you will ask your staff to write the names of people that are in their life because there is some type of paid service that the person's providing for them. So that could be doctors, therapists, hairdressers, mailman. The list goes on. And after they're finished writing all their names, you can ask for a volunteer and just have the person reflect out loud about what their circle looks like. And more than likely, what the person will notice is that they have a lot more names closer to the center of their circle and not as many names toward the outside of their circle. And then you would ask the staff, what do you think this circle would look like for a person with a disability? And more than likely, the person with a disability is going to have a circle that has the majority of their names on the outside. Because unfortunately, a lot of people with disabilities are very isolated. They don't have a lot of friends. Maybe their family hasn't taken much of an active interest in them. And that's when you'll really want to let the staff know that it is going to be their job to change that and to build a circle of support for these individuals that they have the pleasure of serving, the privilege of serving. So even if it's so tempting to sit on the couch and watch TV with the person while you're working with them, it's going to make such a greater impact on that person's life if you take them to that free concert where they could potentially meet their next best friend, or take them to their church, or maybe the flea market, or any activity, or help them find volunteer opportunities in their community. And then hopefully if, by the same time next year, that person, if they drew that same circle, that person would have a lot more names toward the center of the circle for people who actually want to be in their life, not because they're paid to, but because they love and care about the person. So just to reiterate, the direct support professional's role with regard to integration is to help individuals become active members of their community. And one really easy and just, I think is just a really helpful way of helping people get out of the house is to take every month, an hour every month to just create a calendar. So if it's the end of November, you can sit with the individual and create a calendar for December. And maybe go online with the individual, look at citybeat.com or cincinnati.com, and the person can pick things that they like to do that are going to take place that next month, and then just fill the calendar in. And then the person will have all these wonderful things to look forward to. They'll be getting out of the house, potentially making new friends, and it'll really improve their quality of life. And really, there are a lot of low-cost or even free opportunities in Hamilton County. So there's really no excuse for people to stay cooped up. And something really wonderful that came about in 2015 was the creation of 2 new positions in the Innovation and Quality Department. There are 2 people whose entire job is to connect individuals with disabilities with opportunities in their community. And they really welcome your phone call. So you could call Ann Myers and Mark Butterworth anytime you're having trouble finding opportunities for people that you serve. And alternately, you can email the integration email account, which is integration@hamiltondds.org. And that email account is checked every day by Ann and Mark. And they would just be thrilled to help you out. This is what they're really passionate about. So that covers integration, and the next subtopic is self-determination. So when we ask what is self-determination, it is the fundamental right of all people to make their own choices without outside influence. And this is a topic where I really think it is going to be a lot more impactful if you show a video of individuals talking about their experiences trying to have that self-determination. So if you want to pull up the PDF version of this video and highlight the link that I've provided, you can do that, or else you could just Google Credo for support, and you can pull up a video that really covers this topic of self-determination. So according for the Center for Self-Determination, there are numerous freedoms that fall under the principle of self-determination, and some of those are the freedom for individuals to plan their own life and to pursue the things that are important to them, the freedom to experience the same life opportunities as other people their age and to connect with others in their communities, the freedom to use their individual budgets, which is typically waiver dollars, to choose their needed supports, the freedom to choose and set up the support they need to pursue the life that they envision, and the freedom to earn income and have economic independence and security. And then a really important topic to include when discussing self-determination is that of the dignity of risk. And when we think about the dignity of risk, we think about the fact that all people have the right to pursue opportunities that could potentially result in harmful consequences for us. And we can have people tell us until they are blue in the face that we should or shouldn't do something, but really it has so much more meaning when we experience things for ourselves. And this really goes just the same for people with disabilities. However, there are two situations where people with disabilities could potentially have their self-determination impacted. And the first is individuals whose services are funded by Medicaid waivers. They're held to a standard. Anyone served by a Medicaid waiver is basically agreeing to allow that provider to ensure their health and safety. Therefore, if an individual with a waiver is engaging in unsafe behavior that could potentially result in serious injury or even death, it's really the responsibility of the provider to intervene, because the provider does need to ensure health and safety. And if the individual, after the team intervenes repeatedly, continues to engage in this unsafe behavior, there is a chance that that person could lose their services. And this is very rare. It hardly ever happens. However, if it does happen where someone is engaging in this unsafe behavior, the team is going to try to intervene repeatedly. Services are never just going to be yanked away in a fast manner. So really, the team will work with the person to try to keep him or her safe. And then the second scenario is when an individual has a court-appointed guardian. Obviously, that's going to impede the person's ability to make their own choices. But it's always ideal if the guardian includes the individual in the decision-making process as much as possible. And the next subcategory for the role and responsibility of direct care staff is self-advocacy. And I pulled this quote directly from the webpage that I've referenced here. While self-advocacy movement is part of a broader disability rights movement, it is a unique movement because it's led and informed by the individual and collective experiences of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the entire movement is driven by people with disabilities. And if you go to the page that I have listed here, you're going to have a bunch of different videos of people with disabilities discussing their lives. And actually, two of the people that are featured are from Cincinnati, from Hamilton County, Linda Kunick and Marvin Moss. So the next required training topic is incidents adversely affecting health and safety, which is the MUI UI rule. And really, this training for this topic is pretty black and white because you're just going to want to pull all of the training information directly from the rule. And I have listed on the page exactly where you'd find that rule. And the second bullet point is to a bunch of resources because the rule itself doesn't always read clearly for someone who's not well versed in legal terminology. The third bullet point is a summary of the rule, so that's also going to help break down that rule into language that, any person walking down the street can understand. We don't all have to be lawyers to understand it. So it's really important that you include the definition of an MUI, which is the alleged, suspected, or actual occurrence of an incident when there's a reason to believe that the health or welfare of an individual may be adversely affected, or an individual may be placed at a likely risk of harm. And there are 3 categories of MUIs, and I'm not going to read all of those, but it's really important that you actually go through each of those types of MUIs and explain what they mean, because some of those words we don't really use every day. Misappropriation, for example. So it's really important that we don't assume that staff are going to understand what those things mean. And you might want to even give examples as you're describing these different types of MUIs. And then you'll want to include the definition of a UI, and that's an event or occurrence involving an individual that is not consistent with their normal routine operations, policies, and procedures, or the individual's care or their service plan, but it doesn't meet the level of being a major unusual incident. And we get so hung up on whether things are an MUI or a UI, and really what's important at the end of the day is if you're in doubt, just report it. If you don't even know if it's an MUI or a UI, report it. It's always better to err on the side of caution. And we always are so focused on making sure we turn reports in on time, but really the very most important thing is to immediately ensure that the individual is healthy and safe. So now I'm just going to go over the reporting requirements. So the MUIs on the screen there, they're considered the most serious of all the MUIs, and because of that, they have to be reported to the county board within 4 hours. And all the other MUIs should be reported to the county board as soon as possible, but by 3 p.m. the next day at the very latest. And for UIs, those should be reported within 24 hours. And everything you see here on the screen are the required elements that must be included on the MUI and UI report. So this would be a really good time for you to go over your own internal form that you've developed to show staff exactly how to fill them out. And you might even want to do, a mock MUI. Maybe pretend that somebody fell and, broke a leg or something like that. And the people that must be notified rather, when an MUI occurs are the guardian, the SSA, the residential provider, obviously if the situation happens when out of the care of the provider, and then the staff or family living at the individual's residence who have responsibility for the individual's care. And if there's any type of abuse or neglect involved, you have to notify the police. You are a mandated reporter. And it's unfortunate, but 9 times out of 10, the police are actually not going to accept a police report unless the individual chooses to come into the office and file a report. Although sometimes the police will actually come out to the individual's home and allow the individual to give their report that way. But even if they don't accept the report, at least you'll know that you did your duty as a mandated reporter. And if any situation involves the abuse or neglect of a child, you would need to notify Children's Services, and that number is 241-KIDS. So oftentimes staff they'll fill out the MUI reports, but then they'll never really hear back about the report. So it's always helpful to give them information on what actually happens after they submit the report. So you could let them know that Hamilton County's MUI Prevention Department investigates all MUIs, and that everybody involved will be interviewed by an investigator. And then the individual's team, including the provider, will be responsible for creating a prevention plan, and this will reduce the likelihood of the same event occurring in the future. And then agency providers are responsible for investigating UIs, and investigating sounds, a little kind of intimidating, but really all that means is that the agency is identifying the causes and contributing factors and coming up with an effective prevention plan for that UI. Another responsibility of providers is to turn in a semi-annual and annual report. The semi-annual report is due on August 31st of each year, and the annual report is due February 28th. And normally you'll get an email reminder from a staff from our MUI prevention department, and you can just reply and give a list of the MUIs that have taken place that year, that period of time since the last report. And then you'll want to note if any trends and patterns exist. If there have been no MUIs, you'll also be required to let them know that there have not been any MUIs. And another responsibility is to keep a UI log for each individual that you serve. And the log should include the name of the individual, a description of the incident, any injuries, the time, date, location, and preventative measures. In addition to what we just talked about, providers are also responsible for making staff aware of health and welfare alerts, and those are located on the state website. And if it's the first training, the initial training, you would just want to go over the health and welfare alerts up until that point. And then if it's the annual training, you'll just want to go over the health and welfare alerts that took place from the time of last year's training up until the present. So that covers MUI and UI. And the next required topic is rights of individuals with developmental disabilities. And really, the best way to cover the rights is to just go straight through the list of rights that are given to individuals each year when they have their My Plan meeting with their SSA. So I've pulled that list and put it into this PowerPoint. And it'll be really helpful to go through each of the rights with your staff and to provide examples of how this right might be compromised for an individual. So the first one is the right to be treated at all times with courtesy and respect, and with full recognition of their individuality and dignity. The right to an appropriate, safe, and sanitary living environment. The right to food adequate to meet accepted standards of nutrition. The right to practice the religion of their choice or to abstain from religion altogether. And this might be a good time to point out that it's really important that if an individual has a certain church that they prefer to attend, that the staff should take them to their church and not to the church that the staff person enjoys. So really the individual's choice needs to be honored in situations like that. The next right is the right of timely access to appropriate medical or dental treatment, the right to ancillary services, the right to receive appropriate care and treatment in the least intrusive manner, the right to privacy, the right to communicate freely with persons of their choice, the right to ownership and use of personal possessions, the right to social interactions with members of either sex, the right of access to opportunities that enable the individuals to develop their full human potential, the right to pursue vocational opportunities, the right to be treated equally as citizens under the law, the right to be free from emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, to participate in appropriate programs of education, etc., the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, the right to select a parent or advocate to act on their behalf, the right to manage their personal financial affairs based on their ability to do so, the right to confidentiality, the right to voice their grievances, and to be free from unnecessary chemical or physical restraints, the right to participate in the political process, and voting locations are typically accessible for people with disabilities, and then the right to refuse to participate in medical, psychological, or other research or experiments. And I apologize, I did notice a few typos in the listing of these rights. And after you've gone over the rights with your staff, this would be a really good spot to discuss some common behavior that's uncourteous and unprofessional and disrespectful, but that we commonly do see in this profession. So I've listed a few that I've seen. The first is that the staff should think of the individual that they're serving as their boss. So if they wouldn't do something in front of that in front of their boss, they should not do that in front of the individual that they're serving. And then staff should always remember that they are guests in individuals' homes. So they should ask permission before plugging in their cell phone charger, before opening closets and cabinets, entering rooms. They should always encourage the individual to watch what they want to watch on TV and not dominate the individual's television. And then everywhere that they take the individual should be for the individual's benefit. Staff should not be running their errands on the company time. They shouldn't be taking individuals out for their own, benefit. And they really should not be using their cell phones while they're working, unless there's some type of emergency where they do need to be, expecting a call for some reason. They should bring their own food and beverages. And then if the person that they serve is on a special diet, it's so important to just be mindful of what, you're eating around the person. If the person has diabetes and they get really stressed out about keeping their blood sugar low and they get really tempted around foods, it's really disrespectful to bring Kit Kat bars over to their house and just have them laying out on the table. And then finally, speak to individuals as you'd like to be spoken to. And I think this one, it sounds like common sense, but when we've been in this line of work for a long time, I think sometimes we don't always notice our own burnout level, and it's easy to not realize that we're speaking in a tone of voice that's disrespectful or hurtful. So we really have to check ourselves to make sure that we're always being respectful. So that is it for rights. And we're going to move on to universal precautions. And to be honest, universal precautions, it's a pretty basic topic, and there's a lot of information online that agencies can pull to train their staff. And it's the basic premise that all blood and bodily fluids should be treated as though they are infectious. So anytime staff are dealing with bodily fluids, they should be wearing gloves. And again, you can pull the curriculum from online, you can use a DVD. More than likely, you'll be able to find something free that you can use. And there are just a couple additional training requirements that I'm going to go over. Aside from what we discussed, staff should have training on the individual service plan and behavior supports, if applicable, for each person that staff are serving. And it's not enough just to receive the training. There actually needs to be written documentation of this training, and it needs to be put in the staff's personnel file. And it should include the date of the training, the topics that were covered, and it should be signed and dated by the trainer and the person being trained. And behavior supports trainings are typically given by the behavior support specialists at Hamilton County. However, usually it's management that sit in on those meetings. So then after receiving that training from behavior support specialists, they would then move on to train their direct care staff on the behavior supports that the individual needs. And then staff working directly with individuals must be certified in first aid and CPR. And really, we recommend that all staff working for an agency have this certification, because even if it's just someone who only works in the office, you never know if an individual is going to come in to visit and might need some type of emergency help at that point. So after you have trained your staff, there are certain required elements that you should have available to verify that they have been trained. And this is actually what a reviewer will be looking for if your agency is reviewed. So it's really helpful to have a training certificate. And on that certificate, you'll want to list the name of the person that received the training. You'll want to list the topic, the date of the session, the length of the session, the name of the trainer, and a brief description of the training. And if you don't list the brief description on the certificate, you should at least have the curriculum available to show the reviewer. And lastly, I really think it's important to go over some of the best practices for providers. And a lot of these are going to be based on some trends that we've been seeing over the past few years that we would really like to deter providers from engaging in. And that very first one, we would really like to encourage providers to behave ethically with regard to influencing individuals about provider choice and interacting with other providers. So what this means is, it's understood that as an agency that you are a business and that you do want to have enough income to maintain your agency, but there is an ethical way to grow your business, and there are unethical ways to grow your business. If individuals make the choice that they're going to leave your agency and move on to a different agency, offering them money to stay with your agency, that would be an example of something that's unethical. Another example, standing outside of another agency's building and handing out flyers for your agency, that would be considered unethical. Or repeatedly calling an individual over and over again to try to get that person to choose your agency, another unethical example. Or if you happen to be a provider that provides both residential and day services, you can definitely let the individuals that you serve under a residential capacity know that you have a day program, but you should not try to pressure individuals into going to your day program. A lot of providers, when we do complete reviews, will have some citations because they're not aware that some rules have changed. And really the best way to stay current on the rules and best practices is to subscribe to the rules notice. And the way that you do that is to go on the DODD website and go to the rules section. And there's a section that says subscribe to rules notice. And you just send an email to the address that they list under that section, and then you'll be added to the listserv. And if you receive rule changes and you don't understand what they mean, you can always give us a call and we can walk you through what exactly that they mean. The best providers provide strong support and training for their direct care staff. So they're going to have availability of managers to answer staff needs at all times. They're going to have good training from the get-go and continuous training throughout the person's time working for the agency. They're going to have sensible and accessible procedures for staff. They're going to always put individuals first. So anytime you find yourself focusing more on money than on individuals' lives, that's when you know that you're not operating from an ethical standpoint. You want to cooperate with the team. So if the SSA is conducting a monitoring of services, you want to make sure that you have documentation available for that SSA. You want to make sure that you return calls in a timely manner, because everybody really is working together to make sure this person's needs are getting met. And the last thing to note is that we've seen a drastic increase in fraud over the past few years. And we're really not sure if it's on purpose or whether it's accidental, but providers are billing for hours of service that are not being provided. So it's very important to check and recheck your billing multiple times to ensure that you have documentation to back up the hours that you're billing for. If services were not provided, under no circumstances should you bill for those services. In addition to that, you should also make sure that the ratio that you're billing for is accurate. So if you have one staff person who is serving 2 individuals, you would want to bill a 1-to-2 ratio. So I like to include this picture because I think this is the cutest little girl I've ever seen. If you have any questions or comments about this training, you can call me or email me. I'd be happy to help you in any way I can. And on the next page, it's going to give you an opportunity to take a survey. And after you take that survey, you'll be given a certificate so that you can have proof that you did receive this training. And just to note again, this is being offered in both a video format and a PDF Acrobat format. So you can You should be able to save the document, the PDF document, onto your computer and use the resources that I've provided to make your own training. So in order to receive your certificate, just go to the link that I have here on the screen. If you want to open the PDF file, you can highlight this link and go to it. And then after you've completed the survey, you'll get your certificate. And I really appreciate the time that you took to listen to this presentation. And I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you feel confident in creating a training for your staff. Thank you.